So, I think that the work that I do, I feel like my relation to the art world with this work is significantly different than the work of Trevor or Laura, and I tend to think of it in a totally different light. I tend to focus on writing, and I tend to focus on working with people almost in a leaked documents as found to art sense, which is significantly different. Although I am also a photographer, I tend to look at everyday objects and to try to understand our relationship with those objects if they were subverted. And I tend to see the world a little bit differently than other people. For example, I often see convenience as an example of how it's not safe. Things that are very convenient tend to be less secure. That doesn't have to be that way, but that's the way that the world currently is. And some of the reporting that I have done, some of the document processing and analysis that you've seen with WikiLeaks or that you've seen with Der Spiegel, that is something that I've submerged myself in for a long, long period of time. And I've thought a lot about both how to resist it and also how to recognize it. And I've struggled quite a bit with how to make it relevant, but also how to help other people to see these things. A good friend of mine once joked that some people raise their paranoia to match their situation, and other people raise their situations to match their paranoia. And I've been accused of being guilty of the latter. And the thing is, I just wanted to make sure to return that favor to everyone else as well. And so some of the work that we've done with Der Spiegel, particularly Laura and I have done with Der Spiegel, I think we've been able to change the way that people think about these things, such that a year ago, if we were to talk about the things that I'm going to show, such as this USB device, it would be the stuff of Philip K. Dick nightmares, and people wouldn't take us seriously. But especially after Snowden started to reveal what was actually going on in our world, after William Binney, after Thomas Drake, after Jesselyn Radack, after Chelsea Manning, after Julian Assange started to do this work, showing these things, the crazy actually, it didn't seem so crazy anymore. In fact, it started to seem downright depressing, and frankly, many people became quite cynical about it and thought that if they could imagine it, they could no longer be surprised by it. And in this case, this device that's sitting in front of us is a custom-made piece of hardware which the NSA deploys in order to bridge networks or computer systems that are otherwise not attached to networks. And it's a little difficult to see, but when we talk about this in the framework of found art, it can't get better than this. This is actual NSA modeling of a USB cable where the little red part at the bottom is, in fact, the chip that has been added to a regular USB cable that allows this device to be a wireless device that the NSA can use to inject software into your computer. So when you imagine this, you can imagine finding a USB cable and seeing it a little bit differently, knowing that if you don't know the genesis of that cable, you might not actually know what's inside of it. So there are a lot of assumptions that we take for granted when we see a physical object. And it's a document that, like this, that allows us to cross over from, oh, that's a completely ridiculous thought, there couldn't be anything wrong with that, to, well, I did buy it with a credit card. I did get it on the internet. I bought it on Amazon. And yeah, my politics are sort of interesting to some people that might have these capabilities. And then the question becomes one of how we even begin to confirm what this device does. And so we see it potentially very differently once we see documents that prove that these kinds of things exist. And it's very difficult for someone to say that it doesn't exist, because this is a sample from an original document written by the people that build and deploy these tools. And so we can actually see the humor, we can see the brutality, we can see the overall culture of the people that deploy these types of devices. And that allows us to put ourselves inside of their shoes and to imagine some of the things they might build. Though some of the things they build are actually just beyond belief. As an example, this is a similar implant, as they're called. And this is an Ethernet module that also has USB ports underneath it. So if you have a computer, you can imagine looking at your computer, seeing that there's an Ethernet port and 2 USB ports. And now imagine in between the Ethernet port and the USB module, helpfully illustrated by the NSA here, there is a small red profile device in between. And that is a howler monkey device. And the howler monkey device, until a couple of weeks ago when we revealed this in Der Spiegel, and I spoke about this at the Chaos Computer Club, it was the stuff of just wild speculation and science fiction. I mean, really, these things weren't even found in the wild in a way where people could understand them and attribute them to the NSA. And what this device actually does is it allows, again, for a radio channel into the computer. So it's a completely new way of accessing the system in a way where it doesn't matter if you have a firewall, it doesn't matter any of these things. You'd have to have special electronics, such as a spectrum analyzer, and you'd have to be looking for it to know to look for it. And so when you buy a computer on the internet, if you're Laura, for example, you'd have to look at your device knowing that these are the tactics of someone who would wish to silence you, which changes the way that you see the world. So you imagine buying a device like that, and then you realize you wouldn't. It would be, in some cases, just negligent to do so. So this, I think, really changes the way that I looked at devices. And when I started to come into contact with these things and realizing that what was imagined was actually true and it was being done, I found that the most compelling way to share this with the world was to write about it and to speak about it, and in fact, to try to show people how, when they behave a certain way, that behavior actually is part of the design of the object itself. So part of the point of this piece of equipment inside of this is that they want you to buy an object which, for example, is not comprised of free software or free hardware, one where you cannot verify it in any way. And part of the reason is because they are able to insert this, and you will basically never find it as a result. So there's a huge structure, in fact, that you can see, which is proprietary hardware and proprietary software playing into the hands of an oppressor who can also control the mail system. Here's an example of a device which you literally can't see, and probably the best person I think that ever even joked about this was also Philip K. Dick, I think probably in Valis, but definitely in several of his other novels. But this is something which is sort of like spy lore, but also it is a thing of sci-fi at the same time. So there was a thing called the Great Seal Bug, or the Thing, and it was designed by Louis Theremin. And it turns out that Louis Theremin, in addition to making incredibly interesting musical instruments, he also, I guess, had a night job or a day job with the KGB. And so he designed a special resonant chamber which was put inside of a seal of the United States, so the eagle, the wooden eagle, and it was put inside of a US government building. And the Russians actually sent a wave of energy to the device which would cause the cavity of the chamber to actually oscillate the signal. So when people talked in the room, this would cause the signal to actually change, and the reflected signal back would give you the audio of the room if you knew to look for it. And the NSA decided to do better than that. And this is the device in which they actually spray you with basically energy, right? They're radiating you. It's not like radiation in the sense that you imagine an atomic power plant, but as in radio waves. And in sending this energy, what they tend to do is they tend to also work similarly with the other implants by putting something like this in your monitor cable. So when we talk about seeing differently, here's a fantastic example of this. This is part of the Angry Neighbor family of devices, I believe. And this is called Ragemaster. And the Ragemaster device actually is a very, very small chip that when it receives a charge of energy through the constant wave generator that I've just displayed here, what happens is that the signal going from the computer's video chips out to the monitor through the cable, so one of these cables that you see here on the table, it would actually reflect back the signal. So you would be able to see what is on the person's monitor. So in some cases, tampering merely with the cable in transit. Knowing these things really becomes kind of a burden, though. I mean, it's a special thing to know these things are real, because imagine that someone came to you and said, all right, the US government is beaming into my head microwave radiation in order to see the contents of my screen. What leaked documents give us, actually, is that the nature of the object that we have in front of us is not the only nature, and that in fact many people see these objects differently. So as we see technology such as a computer as an object of liberation in some cases, other players specifically groups like the NSA, but certainly the Russian intelligence, the Chinese intelligence, any jerk at a cafe, Steve Jobs, when he was alive. These people see these objects totally differently. And in this case, they literally are able to see what you're seeing in a slightly different way through the eyes of a different device. And this causes me to completely reevaluate the way that I think about everything in the world, especially with regard to working as a journalist and acquiring equipment. This basically destroyed my ability to use the internet. It doesn't matter if I'm using Tor, the anonymity network that I work on, it doesn't make a difference. When the physical world and the internet come together, there are these points, these convergence points in which everyday objects are actually weaponized and turned against us, potentially. And now imagine that you think you might be the victim of this, and imagine what it must be like to decide that your devices aren't doing this. It becomes kind of impossible, and every object is sort of like, in some cases, a cable becomes like an animated snake, right? It's a weaponized thing in your life that it's very difficult to prove that it isn't, in fact, one of these devices. So for example, something like this happens. A couple of years ago, I bought a new computer, and I thought nothing of this at the time. So this is where I bought the computer, and really strangely, it was delivered to Greensboro, North Carolina in the United States. It was also shipped to Whitsett, North Carolina. I neither live in Whitsett nor Greensboro, and at the time I lived in Seattle, in Washington, on the opposite side of the country, in fact, in the United States. And it was signed for by a guy named Eric Bates. Now, I don't know if Eric Bates is a real person's name. I often think about how real names are kind of a strange construct anyway. But then I thought, what could it be? I don't know. So it's probably just a mistake. And I see here that it's delivered again to slightly different cities. So you see Greensboro here, you see Whitsett here. Okay, so maybe it's just Whitsett, and maybe my package was just delivered to Eric Bates. What could that possibly be? Well, one of the things that we've learned, especially thanks to Edward Snowden, is of a process called interdiction. And this is the process whereby all of those objects that I previously mentioned, they gain a little extra attribute. So the problem with this is that now, in retrospect, I think about the computer that I purchased totally differently. Of course, it was always theorized that someone could take your device, they could do something else with it. But what were the chances that would happen in a country where there is the rule of law? What are the chances that when you purchase a thing and you buy it on the internet and it comes in a sealed package that actually someone had opened it and changed what was inside of it, changed the hardware, changed the software? And the point is that we don't know. I don't know. When I look at this, I, however, do see two possibilities now. And that's actually primarily thanks to Edward Snowden and Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald that I now have to see those two realities. But what that means is that when I see this, which is another Tor developer, she ordered a keyboard on the internet. Well, one of the devices we showed in Der Spiegel's publications in December was implants for keyboards. And in this case, Andrea ordered a keyboard, and she lives in Seattle, Washington as well, on the West Coast. And it started in California on the West Coast, and it made its way all the way to Alexandria, Virginia, which is the home of the WikiLeaks grand jury, on the East Coast in the Rocket Docket, which is the most awful part of the United States in the judicial sense. And it's a fine part of the country otherwise. And her first thought was much the same. She said, you'd think that the NSA's shipment interdiction would be more subtle. This is a kind of double consciousness that is sort of bred as a result of learning that these are the types of things where we jump past the surprise, we jump past the certainty, and into the, well, it could very well be. That's the world that we live in now. And this is, for me, one of the key things that Edward Snowden's courage actually has brought forth, is that it would have been impossible to see the world this way and be taken seriously and to really be able to explore this space, to understand what threats these things present to ourselves if it was not for his actions. So to me, this unfortunately is not something that we can solve. Literally, we could spend our time to take apart the keyboard that she purchased, and we might be able to find something in it. We might not, though. Every single device has little computers inside of it with proprietary software, with code inside of it that's unexplained. Each different object has different versions, even when it's completely normal. It's very, very difficult. And this actually reflects a complexity in not only these machines, but it reflects a sort of value system in our society with regards to sustainability, with regards to reproducibility, with verifiability, with integrity, and also about cost optimizations. Now, the strange part about this story, which is not shown in this, is that she actually did receive a package with a completely different tracking number with the keyboard at her house. Now, she says that it's possible that they just made a mistake. I agree, it's totally possible. The interesting possibility that's also opened up is that it's maybe the case, thanks to the documents that we've seen, that maybe there's a value in changing how she behaves and being able to control the very machines that she has. So potentially this keyboard is an agent of the state that exists in her house now. That's a thing which I'm not very comfortable with, actually, and she wasn't either. So she doesn't use that keyboard. At least that's what she said today, and when she has the time, she'll go looking for it. But this, again, is an interesting point because it's not clear to us yet how to even develop what seeing that kind of an implant would look like. Obviously, there are some cases where in the Der Spiegel catalog we show that they say, here's a picture of the implant. They're made from common off-the-shelf parts so as to be non-attributable to the NSA, which is quite funny because thanks to the inside documents, we, of course, know that it is the NSA. They even helpfully included a photo. So a useful thing there to be able to see that. This is another sort of strange thing, right? What we see here is an example of, again, actually how, thanks to Edward Snowden, I have seen things completely differently. And when I've seen it differently, I've wanted to help other people to see it too. So in this case, this is in Ecuador, and this is the United States Embassy. And why I was looking at the embassy is a gentleman by the name of Duncan Campbell and another gentleman by the name of Andy Muller-Magoon showed that it was possible to have walls. And of course, I've read about this in the past in doing research. It was possible to have walls that you could see through with radio waves, but that you wouldn't be able to see through with your eyes. But I always sort of made the assumption that you would never be able to see them visibly, that of course people who are so good at doing these things, they would never make mistakes. And as Trevor, I think, very helpfully, regularly points out, if there's one thing these guys do, it's that they always make mistakes. And then you can see them with your eyes right in front of you. So here's the US Embassy, and what you see along the top line is a satellite dish and then the roof, and then the next line down you see that the fence is covering the building, but you also see a sort of gray strip that turns into a set of windows. And as it turns out, that is a very strange feature of a building. Here in Germany, in Berlin, on Pariser Platz, there is a similar set of paneling which we revealed was one of the special collection sites that they actually used to collect on Angela Merkel. So in the story where we revealed that your great leader was spied on by the NSA, we learned how they do the spying as well, and we learned how to see where those sensors are actually placed on buildings. So I happened to be in Quito, and I happened to have access to a vehicle, and I thought that I would go for a drive and see if it was the same, if they made the same mistake that you could see in Berlin with your very own eyes. And as it just so happens, they did. So this is a photograph inside of a hardware store where a friend of mine and I went and found a ladder, and then we climbed up in the middle of the store, which was a little strange. They were not terribly displeased, but we explained that in order to determine if the ladder met the criteria for purchase, we needed to know if the ladder was suitable for the task at hand. And so we simply set up the ladder inside of the store, and as you can see, the satellite dish is up on top again, and you can see a little surveillance camera up on the corner. But what you'll also notice is the curious lack of glass in what should be a set of windows. I believe, and Duncan Campbell has encouraged me to think of it in this way, that those are dielectric panels, which mean that they do not interfere with electrical signals, and that there are signals intelligence collection equipment on the other side of those panels, which, along with computers for doing the processing, they helpfully look out across a huge valley in Quito, including all of the major cell phone trunking systems and cell phone towers for the whole city. So that's a very useful window, but they don't have any interest in looking at it visually. They want to look at the electromagnetic spectrum with devices for that. And now when you look at a US embassy, or any embassy, including Russian embassies, which I highly encourage you to look at any embassy here in Berlin, there's many of them, you'll see similar things. The Russians tend to do it in a much more subtle way, which is that they have an entire floor of a building and they use the paneling as if that floor was just built with different material. It depends on where you go, but generally speaking, you'll see these kinds of panels, which have, of course, some alter ego to them, if you will. And part of the reason that I tend to look at these things this way is that I'm encouraged by other people. And I'm especially encouraged by people who I think would have been my heroes in another era, and I probably would have wanted to work with them in a totally different way. So for example, this is Bill Binney, who's probably one of the coolest guys you'll ever meet in your life if you have the chance.
You will have a chance, he's coming.
And he'll be here, actually, at Transmediale, but buy him a drink. He should never have to buy another drink again as long as he lives. But this is a picture of Bill Binney in the Democracy Now! Offices just before he went on television to talk with Amy Goodman about NSA spying. And I can imagine in another life how someone like this could be one of the most incredible people to work with and to do it at the NSA. And I say that somewhat reluctantly, but in talking with him, it really sounds like he's doing, some of the greatest work you can imagine, and for the most noble of reasons. He joined the NSA because he wanted to stop atomic holocaust. And the only thing that I could really give him was a picture of himself. And so with my art, in addition to trying to, for example, show a picture of a surveillance system, or to show the architecture behind the surveillance system, or to show other things about the physical world which need to illustrate some of the writing, I wanted to be able to give gifts to people who generally work behind the scenes, who just nobody knows about them. No one sees them at all. Bill Binney is an example of a person like that. He did signals intelligence for the US government, really, I think, mostly against the Russians for the better part of 40 years. And I really respect him, despite the fact that he made different life choices than I might have. And one of the things I thought was to give him this picture. And he seemed pleased with it. I was happy about that. This is a picture of another person who I think is a very brave person, and his partner, and that's David Miranda and Glenn Greenwald. And this is them in their jungle outside their home in Rio with one of their 85 dogs, I think something like 85 dogs. They have more dogs than you can imagine. And this is years ago, actually, I think a couple of years ago. And what I wanted to be able to give to them was something that I saw, which is that they were really in love with each other, and they really lived in a jungle, which is a really strange thing, and they were really surrounded by dogs. I was only able to capture a few parts of that, because it turns out that the only thing harder than taking a picture of one dog and two men in a jungle is like literally 18 dogs with two men in a jungle. And I've spent quite a lot of time in my work as well documenting communities that I have been a part of, and communities that have in fact been split apart. And so I have a sort of chronological progress of photographs of different people. And this is, for example, Julian Assange and Daniel Domscheit-Berg before Daniel was Daniel Domscheit-Berg. Almost no one has seen this photograph, including them. I don't think they've ever seen it. And it's also one of the very rare photographs where Daniel is standing above Julian. Which actually is, I think, really fascinating because it reflects something about their relationship that I think that they couldn't see at the time. But in retrospect, it's quite clear. And this is outside the Volksbühne on Rosa Luxemburg Platz, which I think is actually a really apt place for them to be photographed. This is one of the creators of the Tor project, Roger Dingledine, who was standing in Tunisia. We had spent a lot of time helping and working with, in solidarity and having mutual aid with Tunisians that were working for the revolution against Ben Ali. But in general, we wanted to help people to just freely communicate, and this was our goal. And many people want pictures of Roger, and I wanted to, again, to give him a gift. This is a person who works just behind the scenes, programming day in and day out. And here we see another picture of Julian and Daniel. It's similar. It shows, actually, I think, a bit of the transition of their relationship, although we didn't really know it at the time. This is a person who I try to imagine when I think about his work, describing it to someone that doesn't work with computers. And the best way that I can describe it is to say that he really likes to ride his bicycle and listen to records from Bell and Sebastian. And he does things with computers. But he actually invents programming languages to help people to be able to program computers where they may have divides. And so he actually works to bridge divides between the languages of computers. So for example, he invented a system called CDENT. And this system, what he actually has brought into this world is a very strange thing, which is the ability to take any programming language and convert it to any other programming language. It's a work in progress, obviously. But this is a thing which, imagine trying to illustrate that. I decided that it was impossible, and instead I would just try to capture his nature. And I feel like it shows you a little bit about how hard his work is. This is a person who, in his life, he's basically worked on just one thing, which is exploring. So he's an explorer of the internet. He writes a piece of software called Nmap. So he actually literally scans the internet and writes software for other people to scan the internet. So imagine he's a person who makes a compass. And I wanted to somehow capture that as well. I also thought it was an impossible thing because in each of the different times that I've seen him, he dresses completely differently, he acts completely differently, and he never really reflects in a concrete way what he does as his job, except to say that that does reflect it because he is that. And I try also to show a little bit about the relationship that I have with some of the people that I photograph. This, for example, was one of the most important people in my life, in the whole of my life, in developing my photography, and I never really felt like I understood her. And I feel like that's clear here. These are two people who, in the middle of the world, this is a Mitad del Mundo in Quito, outside of Quito in Ecuador, where I feel like I'm not a material person, and so I try, generally speaking, to give people these types of gifts, although I'm very bad at giving people prints of my photographs. This may also be the first time that they've ever seen it if they happen to be here. I wanted to be able to show them how I saw them, which is two beautiful, strong women that stand above everything and who are always doing something that is incredible and righteous. And they're standing in a really surreal place, which is kind of how I see them in the world, which is I think they're pretty surreal. And here I have a picture of Trevor, actually, and an anonymous cypherpunk where they're looking at their own art. And I tried to imagine that there was some way in which I could give something to Trevor, and I'm not sure that I actually succeeded in it with some of the pictures that I've taken of him. But I wanted to be able to give him a moment in time where he's reflecting about all of the moments in time that he's going to put into space on a satellite to be able to share with people. This is his last pictures project. And so I thought it would be good to try to take a meta picture of him, in fact, looking at his own work, which is collected work, to put into space. And these guys are actors who, they do cultural critiques. So they run a show called Rap News. And Rap News is a really fantastic musical art mixed media project where they do a lot of cultural criticism. And I decided that it was almost impossible to overdo their real life to show them. So one of them is in fact wearing a Guantanamo Bay watch. If you see in the center there, this black watch. That's a Casio F91W. That's the watch where 20 people are in Guantanamo Bay for the sole crime of possessing that watch. It's one of the most popular watches in the world, but it also happens to be a watch that a variation of it was used by Al-Qaeda as a bomb timer. And so as a result, it was possible to take people who had this watch and basically sell them to the US government as terrorists. But in fact, they were not terrorists. They simply possessed the most common, one of the most common watches in the entire world. And I wanted to show these guys out of character of their show and to show them in character as they really are, which is pretty serious guys acting not so seriously. So they're eating trees like koalas. They're in Australia. And I wanted to give that to them as well because everyone cared about them as their characters, not really as them as people, and understood them in that way. And almost all of this film, especially this photograph that's in color, is actually color infrared photograph material, which I've been experimenting with for a long time. And this is actually aerial surveillance film, which used to be flown with 70mm cameras. And this would be shooting grape fields, such as for wine production, where you would want to look for aphids, for example. So high resolution surveillance film, where you really would want to find a thing which was out of place. And I decided to repurpose it and to actually use it for taking portraiture. So in this case, I think you can see it the best of all, which is you can see how the plants completely change and how the person that's in the picture looks completely out of place. But you can also see the vein structures in her skin much more clearly than you could with a normal visual frame. So you actually take the ultraviolet and the near infrared and you sort of compress it into the visual spectrum of the visible light. In this case, it was again that I wished to share with someone what I saw of them, which is I saw someone who was kind of out of this world, and I wanted to give them a picture. I gave them this picture actually to their parents. I didn't think that they should have the picture. I thought their parents should have the picture. So in this, I felt like it was very important to go and explore this. This is one of the first pictures I took with this film, so this is in reverse order chronologically. I wanted to basically show how other people influencing me, I could give back to them, and I wanted to be able to share that with the world. So I also went down a sort of strange rabbit hole with this, which was to make sure that these things would be out there for a long time. I gave them away under a free culture license, so the Creative Commons, and I wanted to be able to make sure that people would actually be able to keep it. So I sort of, in working with these things, I tend to make, if I make a print, I assign them 0 of infinity, because the idea there is that you have all of the materials necessary to create an infinite set of them. And in this case, I think that she's even gone on to produce some of these. So in repurposing surveillance film, what I've found has been really interesting is actually that it's a dying medium. So it's gone now. There are approximately 85, maybe 90 rolls of this film left in the world. And part of what I wanted to do is also to try to imagine how you will see these people over time. So most of these are part of a series. And in some cases, this has to do with generations of people in the hacker culture and the hacker underground, where taking portraits of them is something that normally, since they're never seen in the work that they do, would be seen over time as well, to represent them as regular people in that space, to help bring the tasks that they're completing into a visual space, and also to help them with their own iconography if they wish to. And so in a sense, I wanted to try to tell stories about some of these people, but usually the thing that I've stopped with in telling the story is just to give it as a gift, because I really think that gift culture is an intensely positive thing. But the documentary stories, I think, are the more interesting ones. And the aesthetics, the gift giving to try to return to people that are building our culture, that are building our ability to speak freely, I think that in some cases it is more immediate, it's more useful to tell them as long films. And I think that Laura has some good long films, and she has some really good documentaries in which she does exactly that.